Hi everybody, it's Liam and Sid, and we're going to do Fascist Spain compared to Communist Vienna. So starting off with Spain, the rise to fascism started with the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. And the causes of this was there was an election in 1936 that changed the power from the conservative leader Miguel Primo de Rivera to a more leftist front. They had a liberal leader, and this angered the fascist and the extreme right forces, so they responded by putting an army together and then led a coup attempt. And then this event led into a civil war. And then the sides of this were the Republicans, which was formed by the government and their unions, communists, anarchists, workers, and peasants, so the poorer class. And this was led by Francisco Largo Caballero. Then the other side was the nationalists, and they were the ones rebelling. And they're made up of the bourgeoisie, landlords, and just the upper class. They were led by Francisco Franco. So the Nationalist Party wins because they had backing from Germany and Italy, because they were fascist leaders too. And they put Francisco Franco in power. He was the dictator, or the Caudillo, of Spain from 1939 up until his death in 1975. And he also he also got more support from the Catholic Church, and he combined his fascist and monarchist parties and dissolved other political parties just so he could unify Spain even more. He's anti-Semitic because of his ties with Hitler and tried to rid Spain of the Jews. Even though he was allies with Hitler and Mussolini, he remained neutral because he wasn't economically stable to join the war effort. But he did still help out the Axis powers. And then after his death in Spain, it went back to a monarchy. So his government structure was he had a single party regiment, and he was openly totalitarian and was severely repressive to an authoritarian system with limited pluralism. So he just really wanted to unify Spain to get rid of all the chaos that there was during the Civil War. And he mixed it with fascism and Catholicism. So this created a new form of fascism. And he was one of the only fascist nations after World War II because he remained neutral and the UN didn't dissolve his government structure afterwards. And this helped during the Cold War because he was very anti-communist, so the US liked this, and they were allies with Spain during that time. So social effects under Franco was he wanted to save Spain from the chaos and instability after the Civil War, so he outlawed political parties because he blamed them for the divide and then leading to the Civil War. And he eliminated universal suffrage, severely limited freedoms of expression and association, and he viewed criticism as his regime as treason. So, yeah. He did have some good policy. So some of his policies were the Labor Charter, which set forth the social policy of the regiment, which is all Spaniards have the duty to work, and the state was to assure them the right to work. So he just wanted everyone in the state working for the country. And the law of succession proclaimed that Spain would be Catholic, social, and a representative monarchy. So some of the economic effects were, after the Civil War, Spain was in a depression because they spent all their money fighting each other. So afterwards, they were poor. And Franco established a self-sufficient economy, but it didn't really work, and inflation soared, and then there was barely any recovery. But then after a decade of this, improvement began. So in September 1953, he signed the Pact of Madrid, and that established the United States military bases on Spanish soil, and then the US gave Franco some money to restore the economy. This was during the Cold War. And then Spain's economic structure changed into a free market economy, and the country entered the greatest cycle of industrialization and prosperity it ever known. So the Pact of Madrid was pretty successful and helped Spain out. Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Sid now.
To understand how Vietnam became a communist country, we need to look at Vietnam's history with France and with imperialist powers. Vietnam was invaded by France in July of 1857. The current emperor of France at that time was Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and the last monarch of France. France invaded Vietnam because of missionary propaganda, because they want to spread Christianity, and because the rise of capitalism in France prompted France to invade Vietnam, because Vietnam was the perfect area for France to have overseas market, and because a lot of other European Western imperialist powers were getting spheres of influence in Asian countries and land in Asian countries for economic benefit, and France wanted in. So over the course of 10 years, France slowly conquers all of Vietnam. At first, they can only conquer the southern part before being met with resistance, but eventually they conquer all of it, and they rename it Cochin China. France westernizes Vietnam, and they integrate capitalist policies. They also build infrastructure such as bridges, buildings, and roads. Vietnam to France at this point was a source. Vietnam's primary use to France was to be as a source of raw materials for French industry. Um, so peasants were effectively affected negatively by the new capitalist policies, and one of these policies were the new land policies. Going back to how Vietnam was used as a source of raw materials, there were new lands declared by the French in Vietnam used for farming, and peasants were to farm on these lands, and the resources the peasants would get would be used uh, to help the French economy in the French factories and industry. However, these new lands that were declared were used for French farming and not for actually giving homes to the many homeless people in Vietnam. So this angered the lower classes and the peasants and the homeless. Also, the peasants were sold to landlords to work on these farms, and this was basically tenant farming. And rent to live on these farms was 60% of the crop yield, so peasants were extremely poor and hungry. There was also forced labor for public works. Taxes from public works took a large part of the peasant's salary. There's poor education and only one university for Vietnamese use. And at this point, the capitalist policies introduced by France were harming the peasants more than helping them, and the peasants viewed France and capitalism as the enemy. At this point, they started to gain, the lower class started to gain a very anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist view, and this helped to form the resistance movements that were to come in the future. So, before we get into the beginnings of communism in Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, I first want to talk about those first couple of resistance movements that were heavily anti-imperialist. Um, Before Ho Chi Minh's involvement in the resistance movements of Vietnam, there were a couple of previous anti-imperialist resistance movements that were channeling the energy and the views and the of the peasant people, which, like I stated, like I stated before, were anti-imperialist. Those anti-imperialist views are what kind of jump-started the resistance movements, and all the resistance movements that carried on uh, in Vietnam against the French were all rooted in anti-imperialism, because it was the capitalist policies, it was the French invasion that put the peasants in such a horrible place to the point where they wanted to rebel. So, for the beginnings of communism in Vietnam, we have to talk about Ho Chi Minh, who left Vietnam actually in his early life to travel at sea. He spent years in France, Russia, and China, a part of various communist groups, before returning to Vietnam with a new communist policy. So this is the first time we see not just anti-imperialist, but anti-capitalist resistance movements in Vietnam. So he formed the Vietnamese Communist Party in 1930, and he staged peasant uprisings and gained supporters before World War II, at which point the French had kind of quelled the communist rebellion. But during World War II, Vietnam was governed by the French, but it was under Japanese control since the French had been defeated at this point. Uh, Vietnam was a staging ground for all Japanese military operations in the Southeast Sea, and the Japanese had full control over Vietnam. Vietnam was only governed by the French, but truly its control was given to that of Japanese elites. However, the French are eventually kicked out by the Japanese because the Japanese view them as a threat. They think the French are going to turn on them because they used to be allied powers. And at this point, the Vietnamese introduced their own government. The Vietnamese are now governing Vietnam, but Japan is controlling Vietnam. When Japan is defeated, there is nothing stopping the Vietnamese from seizing power. They are now named the Viet Minh because at this point, Ho Chi Minh kind of finds his way to come out of hiding now that Japan is defeated. He forms an alliance between the communist and nationalist parties, and he makes the Viet Minh, and then they seize power. So this is in 1945. So now the Viet Minh are ruling, have complete control over Vietnam. But a year later, France comes back to take Vietnam. But they are faced with resistance, and Vietnam is split into a communist north and a non-communist south. So at first, there are negotiations and there are peace treaties between the communist north and non-communist south of Vietnam, and this kind of keeps everything at peace. But as time goes on, the French, their ultimate goal is to colonize all of Vietnam. And the Viet Minh's ultimate goal was to unite all of Vietnam under communist government. And these two things clashed with each other. And the French wanted to colonize North Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese want to get rid of the French so that they could unite all of Vietnam. So this sparks a falling out, and then thus starts the First Indochina War. The Viet Minh lead powerful guerrilla attacks against the French, who are crippled by these attacks and kind of losing this war. At this point, the USA sends troops into Vietnam to back the French, and also because the USA are using the policy of containment, they want to stop the spread of communism. The French are losing badly, like I stated before. They're utterly destroyed at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, so they decide to hold peace treaty meeting at Geneva to end the war. And what comes out of this meeting are the Geneva Accords, which are the rules and policies for peace. One of them is the ceasefire at the 17th parallel line, at which the Viet Minh have to retreat north and the French have to stay south. The South is now governed by Ngo Dinh Diem, who is the U.S.-backed president of the South. And since he is U.S.-backed, his main goal is to focus the building up of military to attack the North Vietnamese, because the North Vietnamese are kind of rebuilding their state from war and spreading communism. Their spread of communism is kind of coming into the South, and it's already gotten all of the North. And since Diem is U.S.-backed, U.S. wants to contain communism, they want to stop the spread of it, so Diem decides to build up military, and this is kind of an act of aggression. But there's also the fact that Diem led through to totalitarianism. He persecuted Buddhists and refused to participate in the elections that were promised by the Geneva Accords. And these tensions caused the North and South Vietnam to fall out and to attack each other. At this point, the Vietnam War had begun, and U.S. started sending troops to back the South Vietnamese. The U.S. troops are utterly destroyed by the Viet Cong, which are the northern Vietnamese fighters, through guerrilla tactics, through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a system of trails that helped to supply the Viet Cong that the U.S. could not utilize. So the U.S. Gets destroyed. The U.S. has to pull out. They're losing badly, and they hold peace talks in Paris to end the war. And in 1973, all U.S. troops are withdrawn. However, this doesn't really stop the war in Vietnam, and North Vietnam is just left to do whatever it wants now, so it continues to push into South Vietnam, and South Vietnam succumbs to North invasion, and now all of Vietnam is united under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam is Communist Vietnam. It is a single-party government ruled by the Communist Party, and it has a capital in Hanoi. The 1980 Vietnamese Constitution was passed, and it gave the Communist Party the power to manage the executive and legislative branches. The Communist Party also had dissolved the bureaucracy in South Vietnam because at this point, Vietnam was destroyed by war, especially South Vietnam, and the Communist Party felt like the bureaucracy would not be efficient in rebuilding Vietnam, and instead it wanted to impose single party onto the South, so it dissolved the bureaucracy completely. Le Duan served as the Secretary General, the leader of Communist Vietnam at this time. There were also only communist parties in elections, so only communist parties or parties that were affiliated with the Communist Party were allowed to take place in the elections. Vietnam at this point had aligned closely with the Soviet Union. They were both communist, and they actually signed a friendship pact, a military agreement. And all previously South Vietnamese officials were sent to re-education camps, which were actually prison camps, and they were tortured. So, for the social effects, the Vietnamese government put in a Stalinist dictatorship of the proletariat, and this was established in the South. The working class was given power, and there was a persecution of the rich class, much like the Soviet Union had done, and rich landlords that I talked about a couple slides back were killed. All religions were organized into state-controlled churches because the government, like I said, wanted to completely unify all of Vietnam, so that include all religious practices. Speech was restricted, and those that spoke out against the Communist Party would be punished. That could be jailing, losing your job. And families were separated due to new economic policies. This policy was the new economic zone policy, and basically what happened was people's land was removed from them, and given to the Viet Cong and other war participants as kind of like reimbursement. The people who had their land removed were actually used for farming and agricultural policies that were effective, the socialist policies that the Vietnamese government put in that I'll talk about in the next slide. And these people were sent to these new economic zones, which are zones such as like forested areas that needed to be cleared out for agricultural uses. So as a result, people and families would be sent to different zones, and this separated families. There were also education reforms. The communist government wanted to remove influence from older education systems in the South, and they also put in anti-illiteracy programs. Southern education needed to be reformed, and the anti-illiteracy programs were placed in schools throughout the South for people aged 12 to 50. Also, all education was nationalized and universalized, and all religious influence was removed from education to further unify Vietnam. So, for the economic effects, the Communist Party had to reconstruct Vietnam from its devastation during war, and they felt like the need to do this was they had to expand the industry in the north and the agriculture in the south, and this resulted in the new economic zone policy. So, like I said previously, a lot of workers there, a lot of people in the south who had land, they were removed from their homes and sent to these new economic zones to expand the agriculture in the south, which is what the Vietnamese communist government thought at this time was the right way to rebuild Vietnam. However, they faced sharp opposition from commercial workers in Saigon. They did not agree with the socialist policies, and many of them fled the country via the hundreds via foot or boat. Farmers were forced into state-controlled cooperatives, where a bunch of farmers had to pool in their efforts for food that was all state-controlled. Also, food production was collectivized, and as a result, farmers had to sell their products at really low prices to the government. And this resulted in the creation of black market, where goods could be sold at a high price, and the government had no way to kind of quell this or get rid of this black market. And Vietnam was also subject to trade embargoes by the U.S. and its allies. So sharp opposition to the Vietnamese economic policies kind of made it all of them made Vietnam's economy a huge mess. Adding the fact that the U.S. is putting embargoes on them just puts them in a really bad spot. So right out of declaring independence and unifying, Vietnam has a very hard time trying to rebuild. And you know, by and its socialist communist policies are not agreeing with the southern people, and as a result, like I said, they're finding it very difficult to rebuild.